Bedtime Story for Adults. A late evening at the Lighthouse Kitchen. By the time the evening had turned properly late, the kitchen at the lighthouse had become the warmest place at the edge of the world. Outside, the sea was dark, but not empty. It moved in long breathing lines beneath the cliff, rising and withdrawing, touching the rocks below with patient, tireless hands. The wind came in from the water with salt in it, and cold, and the faint, clean bitterness of kelp drying somewhere along the lower shore. Every few moments the great lamp above the tower turned, and its beam crossed the black water in a slow, pale sweep, passed over the waves, over the slick backs of the stones, over the path along the headland, and then glanced faintly through the kitchen window before moving on again. Inside, there was soup. There was steam on the glass. There was a heavy iron pot on the stove, breathing out the scent of leeks, potatoes, celery, thyme, parsley stems, bay leaves, black pepper, and broth rich enough to seem almost protective. There were folded linen towels warming on the back of a chair, a loaf of dark bread wrapped in cloth, and a wooden board dusted with flour where 2 onions had been cut earlier in the evening. A kettle sat near the rear edge of the stove, muttering softly to itself. Copper pans hung above the shelf. Blue jars lined the sill. The floorboards shone in the amber light as if the room had been polished by old hands and old weather for many years, which it had. The woman standing at the stove was named Mara Lorne. She had been keeper of the lighthouse for almost 11 years, though not officially at first. Official arrangements in places like this were always slower than weather, slower than necessity, and often slower than grief. When she first arrived, she had meant to stay for a season, perhaps 2. That had been enough. The sea, like some people, prefers not to be approached with declarations. It keeps you by degrees, by one winter, then another, by fog, by wind, by the knowledge that certain rooms, once entered honestly, become difficult to abandon without feeling you have left part of your own shape hanging there by the door. Tonight, Mara wore a thick grey skirt, a cardigan with one elbow neatly patched, and an apron the colour of oatmeal. Her hair had come loose once already and been retied without fuss. A faint line of flour crossed one wrist. She stood with one hand on the spoon and one hand on the pot handle, listening to the soup with the attentiveness some people reserve for music. Soup, if one is serious about it, has stages. There is the stage when everything is too separate and must be allowed to surrender. There is the stage when the broth begins to gather those surrenders and turn them into something larger. There is the stage when the scent fills the room, and one must decide whether more salt will deepen or merely flatten. And there is the final stage, the most delicate, when the whole thing is ready and only requires heat enough to stay kind. Mara believed in this. She lowered the flame. The kitchen relaxed around her. From above came the faint mechanical turning of the beacon. From the window, every now and then, a brief travelling bar of light. From the sea, a low, steady hush where the tide entered the hollow beneath the cliff and withdrew again. The whole tower had a rhythm to it at night. Metal, stone, water, wood, breath, work, silence, return. Mara crossed to the table and adjusted the linen towels for no reason except that she liked them there. They had belonged to her Aunt Iris, who had kept the lighthouse before her and believed linen should be used every day, rather than saved for visitors who might never come. "Better the cloth becomes thin with life than stiff with waiting," Iris used to say, while hanging towels in a salt wind so fierce the fabric snapped like flags. Mara still heard her sometimes when she folded them. Tonight the linen was pale cream, softened by years, mended twice at the corners, and smelled faintly of soap, dry air, and the warm wooden chair back against which it had rested all evening. She set 2 bowls on the table, then paused. Then, after a long, quiet moment, moved one of them back to the shelf. The gesture was so practiced, it barely counted as thought. On nights when the wind turned colder than expected, or the sea grew loud enough to make the tower feel remote, even from the harbour below, Mara sometimes laid the table for 2, before remembering she would eat alone. She no longer scolded herself for it. Solitude changes shape over years. At first it feels like absence. Later it becomes routine. And after that, if one is not careful, it begins to speak in habits that disguise themselves as hospitality. She put the second bowl away. The kitchen returned to its ordinary proportions, still warm, still beautiful, still enough. Mara lifted the lid from the pot and tasted the soup. The broth had thickened just slightly. The leeks had gone sweet. The potatoes had softened into the edges of things. She added a little pepper and stirred it through. Outside, the wind shifted. A sharper gust pressed against the western wall and ran along the tower like fingers over railings. Somewhere in the lower hall, a hook clicked softly against stone. Mara tilted her head and listened. The weather had been unsettled all afternoon. Nothing dramatic, no storm. Only that particular uneasy movement of autumn air before the coast chooses what it intends to do with the night. She turned toward the sink, filled a jug, and was just setting it beside the stove when there came a sound from the door below. A knock, not loud, not hurried, merely unmistakable. Mara stood still with her hand on the jug handle. Visitors at this hour were rare, not impossible, but rare. The fisherman who brought smoked mackerel sometimes came late if the tide had delayed him. The mechanic from the harbour once arrived after dusk in a gale with a box of replacement parts wrapped in oilcloth, and a language of complaint so inventive it deserved archiving. Once, years ago, a boy from the village had climbed the path in tears because he believed his dog had been swallowed by fog and needed the lighthouse to call him home. The dog had been asleep behind the cooper's shed. But tonight, the harbour below was quiet. Mara had seen the last of the boats return before sunset. The path along the headland would be slick by now, with sea damp and wind-fallen needles from the cypress near the bend. Anyone who came this late came either because it mattered or because they had misjudged the evening badly. The knock came again. Mara wiped her hands on the apron and crossed the room. In the hallway, the stone held the day's cold. She passed the peg where her shawl hung, the bench where boots were left, the old brass lantern kept for failures of electricity and confidence alike. At the door, she paused, listening beyond the latch. The sea, the wind, someone shifting weight lightly on the step. She opened the door. A man stood there with the dark behind him. For one moment, the lamp from the hall framed him in amber and left the rest of the world outside in black and silver. He wore a coat damp at the shoulders from mist, a scarf loosened once and rewrapped carelessly, and carried under one arm a flat leather satchel darkened by age and weather. His hair, dark with some grey beginning at the temples, had been blown crooked by the climb. He looked neither young nor old, only worn in the clean, respectful way some faces become worn when life has demanded much of them without entirely embittering the result. "Mara," he said, and there was both recognition and apology in the way he spoke her name, as though he had not expected the reality of it to arrive so quickly. "I hope I am not appallingly late." She looked at him fully then, and the years between memory and now shifted like light on water. "Elias?" she said. His expression changed in relief first, then something quieter. It had been almost 5 years since she had last seen him. Not in a dramatic parting way, not in any formal sense at all. He had come to the lighthouse once before, briefly, on an autumn afternoon of rain and low fog, when the harbour pathmarker had failed, and someone from the town had sent him up with a note because he had been nearest and, as the grocer later said, looked like a man who could be trusted with paper. Mara had remembered him because he spoke carefully, because he stood at the kitchen window as though the sea required concentration, and because after tea he had repaired the loose kitchen drawer without being asked, only because it had offended his eye every time she opened it. He had left the same day. Then winter had come, then others, then time, in its usual discourteous competence, had gone on. "You know my preference," Mara said after a beat. "If one must arrive late, it is best to do so with weather attached. It gives the hour an excuse." A faint smile touched his mouth. "I have, unfortunately, brought weather and an inconvenience." "Then come in with both." He stepped inside. The cold entered with him, salt and wind and night carried in the folds of the coat. Mara shut the door against the gust and took his satchel before he could protest. "You remember the way to the kitchen?" she said. "I remember the smell before the room. So the room remains competent. And dangerous." She glanced back. Dangerous. To anyone intending to leave quickly. That pleased her more than it should have. She did not let it show. In the kitchen, Elias paused just past the threshold, the way people always did, not because the room was grand, but because it was complete. The stove, the towels, the soup, the warm table, the crossing light from the lamp above the tower, the dark water beyond the window. Certain rooms do not merely contain comfort, they declare a doctrine of it. He drew off his gloves slowly. His hands were reddened by cold. Near one thumb there was a smudge of ink, half faded. Mara noticed it immediately. "You have been writing in the weather again," she said. Elias looked at the ink as though he had forgotten it was there. "Only notes, and some names. That is how most dangerous writing begins." His laugh was low, brief, and real. He removed the coat and hung it by the stove. Beneath it he wore a dark wool sweater and a shirt whose collar had given up any illusion of city discipline. Mara set the satchel on the bench and turned back toward the pot. "What is the inconvenience?" she asked. "The southern marker lamp has gone dark." Mara nodded once. "I thought the wind might have found it." "I was coming from the archives in town. The harbour master asked whether I might tell you on my way back down, because he has twisted his knee and resents stairs tonight with evangelical passion." Mara snorted softly. "That sounds like him." "I intended only to deliver the message. Then the gusts worsened near the headland, and I was halfway up the path already, and the kitchen. He looked around. The kitchen made argument difficult. It has practice. She reached for the spare bowl again, this time without removing it. "You are staying long enough for soup," she said. Elias began. "I would not want to intrude." "You are already here. Intrusion has become logistical. Sit down." He obeyed. There is a particular relief that passes through a person when they are too tired to continue performing, not being tired. Mara saw it in the way his shoulders settled once he sat on the bench beneath the window. Not collapse, not weariness made theatrical. Simply the body recognizing warmth and allowing itself for a moment to arrive. She ladled the soup. Steam rose. She set bread between them, cut thick slices, added a small dish of butter, and carried both bowls to the table. Elias looked at the meal with a seriousness that made her trust him all over again. "It appears," he said, "that I have accidentally entered the best possible version of lateness. That depends on your standards." "My standards improved the moment I reached the door." They ate. At first, as often happens with people who once knew each other just enough for memory to remain warm but unfinished, the conversation moved around practical things. The southern marker lamp, the old harbour master and his knee, the state of the road inland after last week's rain, whether the grocer's daughter had really taken up the violin, or whether that was only an optimistic misunderstanding of what had occurred in her parents' sitting room. Elias reported, with dry compassion, that the violin was real and the optimism unfounded. Then, more slowly, because the night invited it, other things entered. "The archives," Mara said. "You mentioned them." Elias tore bread. "I am helping catalogue a maritime collection the council nearly allowed to mildew itself into folklore." "How civic." "Very. Boxes of ledgers, maps, tide notes, letters from captains whose spelling did not consider itself answerable to government. And you volunteered." "I was asked." "Which is not the same." He smiled. "No." The beam from the lighthouse crossed the window, silvered the rim of his bowl, and moved on. "I had some months free," he said. "Or what passes for free when one's profession is built on giving structure to paper no one else wishes to face." The council offered a room above the old chandlery. The harbour master offered warnings, the librarian offered tea, and the sea. He glanced toward the dark window. The sea offered itself in the usual unpersuasive way. Mara watched him over her spoon. "You came because of work." "I came because work allowed the coming." That answer was truer than the first one, and they both knew it. Mara did not press. Instead, she tasted the soup again and found it better for the waiting. Outside, the wind ran once more along the tower wall. The sound was softer now, less uncertain. The weather had made its choice. It intended a cold night, but not a violent one. Elias ate 2 bowls. Mara approved of this without comment. When she rose for tea, he reached automatically for the bowls and carried them to the sink as if he had been doing so here for years. She noticed the old drawer, the one he had once repaired. It still opened smoothly. "You see," she said, while spooning leaves into the pot, "this is exactly how people end up invited again. By carrying dishes. By remembering where they belong." He looked down at the bowl in his hand, then back at her, and something in the room altered very slightly. Not dramatically, only enough for both of them to notice and not speak of it. Mara poured tea, black tea tonight, with bergamot and a little dried lemon peel because the evening required edges as well as warmth. She set the cups on the table, moved the lamp nearer, and the kitchen drew itself closer into gold. For a while, they did not speak at all. The silence did not ask to be managed. The lighthouse beam passed. The kettle ticked softly as it cooled. The sea breathed under the cliff. Elias sat with both hands around the cup and looked not at Mara, but at the window, where the dark water accepted and released the rotating light in endless long intervals. Mara knew that look. It belonged to people who are not merely seeing a place, but allowing its scale to rearrange something in them. "Still dangerous," he said quietly after a while. "The kitchen. And the light." Mara followed his gaze. "You say that as though it has intentions. I say it as a man who has spent too many years in inland rooms." He paused. Some places return proportion abruptly. She leaned back in the chair. "The tower does not believe in self-importance. It makes one useful or absurd, sometimes both." "I remember." He said it so simply that at first she thought he meant the room, the first visit, the repaired drawer, the tea years ago. Then she realized he meant something wider. "You remember," she repeated. Elias set down the cup. "The first time I came here," he said, "I was in a very orderly state of ruin." Mara did not move. The phrase opened something she had not known she had been waiting for. "I had just left my university post," he went on, "officially by choice. In truth, because I had become unrecognizable inside it. Too many committees, too many hours speaking carefully in rooms where no sentence changed anything. Too much time arranging texts while my own life..." He gave a short, humorless breath. "My own life was busy becoming uninhabitable." Mara listened. "We had lost a child," he said. The words entered the kitchen with a plainness that made them more difficult, not less. Mara lowered her eyes to the table. Elias looked instead toward the linen towels on the chair, as if placing the sentence in the room required a point of softness to rest against. "It was not a dramatic story," he said after a moment. "No tragedy in the theatrical sense, just a pregnancy that advanced far enough for hope to become furnished, and then ended before birth. Doctors, corridors, careful voices. Statistics deployed as if they were architecture. My wife, Anna, carried the greater weight in every possible way. I carried paperwork and cups of tea, and a look people interpreted as composure, because they are often more comfortable with that." The kitchen remained still around them. A late gust moved at the window. The light turned over the sea. "We had been unhappy already," Elias said. "Not cruelly, not spectacularly, but in the exhausted civil way some marriages become unhappy. We mistook competence for closeness. We were excellent at travel plans, receipts, mutual calendars, and the correct purchase of lamps. We were not good at grief. Or perhaps grief simply removed the last polite boards, covering what had already gone hollow." He stopped there. Mara reached for the teapot and refilled his cup without asking. He watched the tea rise, then said, "We separated the following spring." Mara nodded once. "I am sorry." "So am I," he replied, though not always in the direction people expect. The honesty of that settled between them. The beam crossed the water again. From far below the cliff came the faint bell of a buoy, a sound so distant it seemed almost imagined. Mara rested one elbow on the table. "When you came here before," she said slowly, "you stood by that window as if the sea were accusing you." Elias's mouth shifted towards something like a smile. "It may have been. No, the sea is not specific enough. But you looked..." She searched, as if you had reached the edge of something and not yet decided whether that was a comfort or an insult. He looked at her then with an attentiveness that made the years between the first visit and now seem unexpectedly thin. "That is almost exactly right," he said. She lifted a shoulder. "I have had practice with edges." There it was then, her turn, or at least some beginning of it. The room had already made enough truth possible that withholding her own history entirely would have felt like a discourtesy. Elias did not ask. He only waited. Mara took a breath and let it out slowly. "I was engaged once," she said, "many years ago, before the lighthouse, before the sea learned my temper." That brought the faintest warmth to his expression. He was a doctor in the city, kind, brilliant, too admired by everyone except his own sleep. I loved him, or thought I did in the way one loves a future one has not yet tested. We were to marry in June. We had plates from an aunt neither of us liked, and curtains chosen with such care one would have thought windows moral questions. Elias smiled down into his tea. "What happened?" he asked quietly. "Nothing dramatic," which may be the least satisfying answer and the truest. He wanted a life built around a scent. Better hospitals, better district, better dinners with people who spoke of architecture and investments and charity in the same breath. I wanted... She looked around the kitchen, the lamp, the steam, the breadcrumbs left on the board. I wanted rooms that could survive being lived in. I wanted mornings not governed by ambition. I wanted work that touched the hand as well as the head. We confused affection with suitability until the confusion became impossible to ignore. And then, he married a woman who understood crystal glasses. That startled a laugh out of Elias, gentler than the sentence deserved. I came to my Aunt Iris for one summer, Mara continued. She had strained her wrist-lifting paraffin tins and wrote me a letter saying, "Come here and be useful for once, in a way that does not require shoes with heels." I arrived furious, heartbroken, overdressed, and entirely unqualified for weather. "And the weather kept you?" Mara smiled. "Against all expectation?" Elias looked around the kitchen again. The stove, the towels, the thick walls holding warmth against the sea. It did well. I have told it so on certain mornings. The night deepened further. By now the harbour below would be nearly dark, except for the public lamp by the quay, and perhaps one or two windows where someone read too late or worried too long. Up here, however, the kitchen felt increasingly detached from ordinary clocks. It was not outside time exactly, more as if time in this room had thickened, broadened, allowed each minute enough substance to be inhabited properly before the next one arrived. Elias seemed to feel it too. "There are very few places," he said after some time, "where one is not immediately expected to become more legible than one is prepared to be." Mara turned the cup slowly in her hands. "The lighthouse does not care about legibility, only maintenance. That may be why it is kinder than most institutions." She laughed softly. I should have that engraved on the supply cupboard. Outside, a harder gust rattled the latch in the lower hall. Mara looked toward the ceiling. The lantern room will want checking before midnight. Elias set down his cup. May I help? Do you still know your way up the stairs without misjudging the final turn? Probably not. Then yes, it will keep you humble. They rose together. Mara took the hand lamp from its hook, though the stairs were lit enough. The spiral up through the tower always felt different at night, closer, more interior. The stone held cold where the kitchen had held heat. Their steps sounded in measured intervals. Through the narrow slit windows, the sea appeared only in fragments, lightless until the beam swung and made a brief white path over blackness. Elias followed close enough that Mara could hear the fabric of his coat brushing the wall at turns. At the first landing, the smell changed from wood smoke and soup to oil, metal, salt, and the faint, dry warmth of machinery. At the second landing, Mara paused to listen. Do you hear that? She said. Elias stood still. The drag at the west turn. He listened. The great mechanism above gave its revolving labour, deep and rhythmic, but within it there was indeed a small roughening, almost a hesitation. Yes, he said, like a throat clearing. Exactly. They climbed to the lantern room. At the top, night opened around them in every direction. The glass enclosed a world of dark water, pale foam, and distant shore lights. Cloud moved low in the west, thinning enough that the moon could occasionally silver the ridges of the sea. The beam turned through it all with a patience so complete it seemed almost moral. Each sweep passed over the water, over the path, over the black ribs of rock below, over the harbour far off, then back again. Brightness. Interval. Brightness. Elias moved to the glass. No one ever entered the lantern room for the 1st or 50th time without altering slightly. Mara had seen it in children, in mechanics, in visiting officials, in men who spent their lives at sea, and once in a bishop who wept without apparent embarrassment while pretending to examine the Fresnel lens. Up here, scale becomes unmistakable. One's own concerns remain real, but they lose the privilege of seeming central. Mara opened the maintenance panel, checked the gearing, and added a measure of oil to the west turn, and listened until the drag softened back into smooth motion. There, she said. Elias did not answer immediately. He stood with one palm resting against the iron frame, looking out over the water as if the darkness itself were legible from here. My wife and I came to the coast once before everything failed, he said at last. Mara straightened, letting the panel fall shut. Not here, farther south. We rented a cottage with damp books and a broken clock. She spent 2 days collecting shells she did not want, and one day asleep under a blanket while I pretended to work on an article no one now remembers. He smiled faintly without turning. It should have been an ordinary good memory. For a long time I could not touch it without feeling punished by contrast. Mara crossed to the opposite window and looked out toward the harbour lights. And now it feels ordinary again, which is, I think, a form of mercy. She nodded. Far below them, the sea entered the cavern under the cliff and withdrew with that deep, folded hush Mara had known for 11 years. The tower turned. The beam moved. Elias breathed. Beside him, the lens gathered light and sent it outward in its fixed, solemn rhythm. Do you ever tire of this? He asked quietly. The repetition? Mara considered the question seriously. It had been asked before, usually by visitors who confused repetition with confinement. "No," she said. "I tire of weather sometimes, of paperwork, of the board's correspondence, of trying to explain to men in offices why rust is not a personality flaw, but the rhythm itself." She looked up at the lens. No. Repetition can be a kindness when the world elsewhere has become too inventive. Elias turned then, and the moving light caught one side of his face before passing on. "That," he said, "may be the clearest defense of devotion I've ever heard." Mara snorted softly. "I meant no such grandeur." "Perhaps devotion rarely does." The words stayed with her all the way down the stairs. When they returned to the kitchen, the room seemed warmer than before, as if the climb through cold and machinery had sharpened its welcome. Mara added another log to the stove. Elias unwound his scarf and left it on the bench. The tea had cooled, so she set fresh water on. He moved toward the shelf, found cups without needing instruction, and she let him. That too changed something. Small permissions often matter more than formal invitations. Soon the room held a second round of tea, now darker and stronger, and a plate of oat biscuits Mara had not meant to offer, but found herself placing between them because certain evenings seemed to widen appetite rather than spend it. They sat again, this time closer to the fire. Elias on the bench still, but turned slightly toward the room. Mara in the armchair beneath the folded linen towels, because she had decided the towels were happier there than warming uselessly. The conversation shifted once more, this time towards smaller things, which often means more intimate things. How one sleeps, what books one returns to, the first jobs people had, and the strange skills those jobs leave behind in the body. Elias had once worked in a library basement where he learned to distinguish mold from leather rot by scent alone. Mara had spent one disastrous month in a bakery when she was 20 and still woke in anxious dreams to the feeling of underproofed dough. "You," Elias said, "were not made for bakery panic." "No one is. Some people seem to enjoy catastrophe while dusted in flour. Those people should be supervised." He laughed. Mara liked, she discovered, the way he occupied the room. Not heavily, not apologetically. He did not fill silence merely because it existed. He did not inspect the kitchen as some men did, as though domestic competence were a performance staged for their notice. He simply sat among the objects, as though each had a right to be there. Bread knife, kettle, spoon, lamp, towel, bowl. Such respect for ordinary things is not common, and once noticed becomes difficult to overlook. Outside, the weather settled decisively. The wind lessened to a travelling murmur at the corners of the tower. The sea remained audible, but not forceful. Clouds thinned. Once, across the window, the moon appeared full enough to silver the line of foam below the cliff. Mara opened the shutter by an inch. Cold air entered at once, and with it the scent of brine and rock. Elias turned toward the sound. "Listen," she said. They listened. The tide had reached the point in its turn, where the water in the cavern below no longer thudded but folded, as if thick fabric were being drawn through stone. Above that came the softer brush of wave over pebble. Farther out, nothing but open sea. "It sounds," Elias said after a while, "like breathing beneath a blanket." Mara looked at him. That is exactly how Iris described it. He smiled. Then I am honored to have unknowingly stolen her language. You may keep it. She stole half her better phrases from weather anyway. The window remained open just enough to cool the room beautifully. The stove answered with deeper warmth. The whole kitchen now felt balanced between elements: fire and salt, light and dark, cloth and stone, soup and cold air, memory and what had not yet become memory. Mara found herself thinking, not for the first time, how strange it was that certain people return not with force, but with fit. Elias's presence did not feel like interruption. It felt, unsettlingly and peacefully, like the room had been waiting to discover where he belonged. That thought might have alarmed her once. 5 years ago, perhaps, or 10. Now it merely asked to be noticed and left alone for a while. Elias broke a biscuit in half and said, without preamble, "I nearly left the town last month." Mara looked up. Because the work finished. Because the work could have finished. He turned the piece of biscuit in his fingers. There was an offer from a university inland. Temporary lectureship, good terms, better salary, predictable rooms, people who say interdisciplinary with confidence. Mara's mouth curved. How impossible to resist. I was very nearly sensible. And yet, he glanced toward the window, toward the sea, the light, the dark path beyond. And yet the thought of leaving felt wrong in a way I could not defend on paper. Not because of romance about the coast. I distrust romance when it arrives wearing fog as an argument. More because I had begun, very quietly, to feel... He stopped and laughed under his breath. This will sound embarrassingly sentimental for a man with an ink stain on his hand and an excessive knowledge of shipping ledgers. I am prepared. I had begun to feel less adjacent to my own life here. Mara did not answer immediately. That sentence went under the guard of her practiced composure and settled somewhere deeper. Less adjacent, she repeated. Yes. As if things were once again occurring in the same room I occupied, instead of one room over. The lighthouse beam crossed the table, silvered the biscuit crumbs, moved on. Mara looked down at her hands. "I know that feeling," she said quietly. Or rather, I know the absence of it. Elias waited. She lifted her gaze toward the crack of cold window. The first 2 years here, I was still living elsewhere in my head. In arguments I had not finished. In versions of myself, I thought I ought to mourn more elegantly. I could mend shutters, clean lenses, keep supply inventories, and walk the cliff path in fog. But inwardly, I was forever in another room. And then one winter, the boiler failed during a storm, and I spent 6 hours carrying hot water up and down stairs with Iris while she insulted every engineer in Britain. At dawn, I sat on the kitchen floor, too tired to think. And she handed me tea and said, "There you are. You've finally arrived." Elias smiled slowly. I would have liked her very much. Most people did, even when attacked by her views on management. The second pot of tea emptied. Mara rose for water once more. Elias followed her to the sink, and this time their shoulders almost touched in the narrow space. Neither moved away quickly. The small awareness of nearness existed, acknowledged by the body before language had the chance to arrange it. Then Mara reached for the kettle, Elias for the cups, and ordinary motion resumed around the fact. He dried the bowls left from supper while she filled the pot. "You still dry dishes too carefully," she said. I prefer plates not to remain emotionally damp. That is not a recognized category. It should be. Mara laughed and passed him the linen towel. He took it without comment, but she saw the way his thumb rested briefly at the worn, mended edge. Recognition again. Not only of fabric, of history held in use. When they returned to the table, the night had passed into that later hour when even wakefulness grows quieter. The town below would be fully asleep now, the harbour lamp only. Perhaps a lantern on one boat. Otherwise, darkness. Up here, the lighthouse continued its turning. The kitchen held. The fire gentled itself lower. Mara could feel the fatigue of the day arriving, not unpleasantly, but with authority. Elias seemed to sense it too. "I should go down soon," he said. She nodded, though something in her chest tightened against the idea more than seemed sensible. "The path will be wet, but clearer now the wind has dropped." "I know." He did not rise yet. Instead, he reached toward the satchel. He drew out a folded packet of papers and laid them on the table. Mara looked. "What is that?" "Maps from the archive. Copies, not originals. Coastal charts. Some from the 19th century. One from before the new quay." He hesitated only a beat. "I thought you might like them." Mara touched the top sheet. Fine lines, depths, notes in brown ink, the old naming of currents and shoals. She looked up. "You brought me maps." "I brought you excuses for future tea, if that is not too transparent." Her heart gave one distinct unhelpful movement against her ribs. "Transparent," she said, keeping her tone steady. "But not unwelcome." Elias held her gaze for one quiet second longer than politeness required. "Good." The room shifted again, this time more clearly. Still no declarations, no theatricality. But now there was intention in the air, and both of them knew it. Mara stacked the maps carefully and set them aside from the crumbs. "You may bring the others," she said, "provided the marker lamp does not continue staging protest for the privilege." "It likely will. Then the excuse is secure." They stood at last. Mara fetched his coat from the hook by the stove. Elias took it, but when he slipped one arm into the sleeve, she instinctively lifted the collar clear for him, and suddenly they were close again. Not accidentally this time, not fully deliberate either, merely in that charged domestic space where ordinary gestures turn briefly more visible than they have any right to be. He turned his head slightly as the coat settled. "Mara." She looked up. There are moments when a room becomes so quiet that even the sea seems to withdraw a little to make hearing easier. This was one of them. He did not say anything grand. Thank God he did not. He only said, very softly, "I am glad I came up the path tonight." The honesty of it made her answer equally plainly. "So am I." That was all. And it was enough. She walked him to the door with the hand lamp because the steps outside the tower held damp and the path turned treacherous where cypress needles gathered. Beyond the threshold, the night had cleared beautifully. The sea was still dark, but the moon had found its way free of cloud and laid a pale, broad light on the water between the moving beam of the lighthouse. The path along the cliff shone silver in places. Wet grass leaned under faint wind. At the first marker post, they stopped. From here, the tower rose behind them white and enormous, lantern turning above like a patient thought. "You need not come farther," Elias said. "I know." He stood with one hand on the satchel strap, the other holding the lamp she had lent him for the descent. The sea breathed below. A gull cried once far off and was silent. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'll return with the rest of the charts, and perhaps a proper report on the archives, if you wish to be burdened by civic disaster." Mara folded her arms against the cold. "I wish to hear everything, especially the disasters involving handwriting." He smiled. "And the marker lamp," he added. "If you intend to inspect it after dawn, I can meet you at the bend and save you the less dignified ladder work." She considered, though not for long. At 10. At 10. The beam crossed over them then, whitening the path, the cliff grass, his face, then moving on. In that brief, pale brightness, he looked not younger, not handsomer, not transformed at all, only exactly himself and standing there, which is sometimes more disarming than any charm. "Good night, Mara." "Good night, Elias." He turned and began the descent, the lamp making a warm, low arc over the wet path. Mara watched until he reached the second marker and became smaller, and then the third, where the harbour lights began to claim him. After that, she could no longer separate him from the dark and the moving beam. She stood a moment longer in the cold. Then she went back inside. The kitchen met her with warmth and the faint scent of tea leaves and soup cooling in the pot. Yet it was not the same room, not because anything had been moved. The table remained, the bowls were stacked, the linen towels still hung, the maps lay on the shelf. But rooms absorb witness. They take shape from conversation, from truth told in them, from the specific weight of 2 cups instead of 1. Mara banked the stove lower, closed the window, and washed the last spoon. Before bed, she opened the first map. The ink lines flowed like thought. Depth marks, sandbars, old notes about currents near the reef. One careful annotation in a hand long dead. Caution in heavy swell. Mara traced the edge of the coastline with one finger and smiled without quite meaning to. Less adjacent to one's own life. She understood that sentence too well. She folded the chart again and took it upstairs. Her room, halfway up the tower, was small and simple. Narrow bed, a thick quilt, bookcase, washstand, one old chair, one round window through which the beam occasionally passed like an unworried ghost. She undressed slowly, listening to the familiar sounds of the tower settling into deeper night. The machinery above, the low whisper of the sea, the click of a pipe as the warmth in it cooled. The whole building, still awake though the hour had gone long. She lay down. Sleep did not come at once. Not because of agitation, more because certain evenings alter the interior weather enough that the mind, even tired, wishes to sit with it a little longer before yielding to dreams. Mara watched the pale circle of the round window brighten and fade with the turning beam. She thought of Elias on the path, of the first visit years ago, of the repaired drawer she had never once allowed herself to think about as a symbol, because symbols often make fools of practical women. She thought of the maps, of Anna, whom she had never met and now would never imagine simplistically, of her own almost marriage with its careful curtains and elegant suffocation, of Iris's voice saying, "There you are, you've finally arrived." Then, quieter still, she thought of the way Elias had stood in the kitchen, not as a guest passing through, but as someone who had recognized the room before crossing fully into it. That, more than anything else, followed her into sleep. Morning at the lighthouse began before dawn, and usually without negotiation. Mara woke to the change in the quality of darkness. Sea places teach the body this. Night does not simply end, it loosens. Sound alters first. The waves below take on a paler edge. The wind loses some of its inwardness. Gulls begin with one uncertain call, as if testing whether dawn has been properly authorized. Then the sky, invisible at first from bed, begins to think about silver. She sat up beneath the quilt and listened. The sea had calmed further overnight. Good. The marker lamp would be easier to inspect. She thought of the bend in the path. 10 o'clock. Then she scolded herself lightly, not because the thought was improper, but because it had arrived before tea. She dressed, braided her hair more neatly than necessary, and went down to the kitchen. It smelled faintly of last night still. Soup, tea, warm iron, linen drying. She liked that. Some rooms behave too eagerly in the morning, all light and recovery, pretending nothing meaningful happened after dark. The Lighthouse Kitchen was not like that. It held memory honestly, then made breakfast. Mara lit the stove hotter, set oats to cook, sliced an apple into the pan with butter, and opened the back ledger to note the southern marker lamp, west turn oiling, and wind direction overnight. On the margin beside the date she wrote, in smaller script than usual, Elias Hale. No, she crossed that out at once with irritation at herself. Elias Vane. Maps. She stared at the line, then closed the book. Breakfast did not care for self-consciousness, and neither should she. The morning filled quickly, as lighthouse mornings always did. There was the signal report to send to the harbour. There were supplies to check in the lower room. The polished brass needed wiping because sea air is a tireless enemy, and only the sentimental underestimate it. By 8:30, Mara had carried oil to the service landing, answered a note pinned to the basket by the quay, and informed the gull on the south rail that its opinions regarding fish offal were not binding on lighthouse management. At 9:45, she was at the lower path with a tool satchel and a ladder hook. Elias was already there. He stood by the bend where the cliff path widened enough for the marker post to be approached safely, one hand in his coat pocket, the other resting on the ladder he had, of course, brought himself. Beside him sat a wrapped bundle that must be the remaining charts. He looked up as she came down the path through the thin, clear light of morning. The sea below had turned steel blue under a high, pale sky. The headland grass bent silver green in the wind. Frost still held in the shadow of the wall where the sun had not reached. "You are early," Mara called. "So are you." "I live here. It is cheating." I borrowed the harbour master's ladder and an excessive sense of purpose. Mara set down her satchel. "Then the morning is appropriately equipped." Together they inspected the marker lamp. The glass housing had loosened on the western side exactly as Mara had expected, and salt had worked itself into the hinge. Elias held the ladder. Mara climbed 2 rungs and adjusted the casing. He passed up the screwdriver without needing instruction. She handed down the rusted pin. He examined it and said, "This has the moral stability of wet pastry." She laughed and nearly dropped the bracket. The repair itself was simple. Simple repairs often are, once one has reached them. The difficulty lies in noticing at the right moment, and then bringing the ladder before weather changes its mind. When the lamp was secured and relit, The little flame held steady behind the glass. Mara stepped down from the ladder. Elias looked up at the result and nodded with quiet satisfaction. "There," he said. "Civilized again." Mara wiped her hands on the rag. "Temporarily. All good maintenance is temporary." That sounds uncomfortably like a philosophy. I spend too much time with archives. Everything becomes one. She glanced toward the bundle at his feet. And the maps. Safe from civic disaster. He handed them over. Though one may have tea damage from the librarian if you do not store them flat. Mara took the bundle. Their fingers touched briefly at the edge of the paper, and neither pretended not to notice. The morning light was too clear for concealment anyway. "Will you come up?" she asked, and was grateful that the invitation sounded almost casual. Elias looked toward the tower, toward the path, toward the sea. "I have nowhere more necessary to be before noon. Then breakfast remains possible." The kitchen in daylight was a different room from the one he had left at night, yet not an entirely changed one. Morning showed more of the work. Knife marks on the board, ash in the stove tray, the exact blue of the jars on the sill, the stack of logs by the door, the mended places in the linen. Nothing romanticized, which was, Mara thought, one of its best qualities. She set coffee on instead of tea, because morning required honesty. Elias unpacked the charts and spread them on the table while she fried eggs and reheated bread. At one point, he held down the curling corner of an old coastal survey with the butter dish and said, "This, I think, is how scholarship ought always to be done. With butter. Preferably." They ate at the table over the maps. Morning light moved across soundings, coastlines, notes about shoals and channels. Elias explained the handwriting of a retired harbour clerk who had spent 40 years documenting storms in language more fit for opera. Mara showed him where the older chart misjudged the reef in heavy winter surge. He listened. Really listened. Not as some men did, with the politeness that masks instruction gathering itself for later return, but with genuine attention. She felt that too. By the second cup of coffee, the room had shifted into that unmistakable ease, which comes when the hour has gone beyond accident, but not yet into demand. Elias leaned back slightly on the bench and looked around the kitchen. "Inland people," he said, "do not understand what they are missing." Mara cut another slice of bread. "Soup." "That too, but I meant rooms like this, rooms where the day can enter without trying to dominate what the night discovered." She glanced up at him. "That is almost a poetic sentence. I am trying to behave badly with purpose." "Then continue." He smiled. Outside, gulls crossed low over the water. The marker lamp down the path held its place in the clear air. The lighthouse, for once between tasks, seemed almost to rest. "What I mean," he said more quietly, "is that last night did not feel borrowed." Mara still had the bread knife in her hand. She set it down carefully. "No," she said, "it didn't." For a moment, neither spoke. The kitchen did not need help. Then Elias said, "I would like to come again," without needing a broken lamp or official papers as camouflage. Mara looked at the maps, the bowls, the linen, the line of sunlight now warming the sill, then at him. "You may," she said, "provided you continue to respect the treaty concerning that chair." His expression warmed into something clearer than amusement now. "I would not dare violate it." Good. And perhaps, he added, I might bring mackerel one evening. The harbour fisherman told me yesterday I look trustworthy enough to carry fish if properly instructed. That is a dangerous compliment from him. But yes, bring mackerel. The answer seemed to settle into the room as naturally as the light had. No declaration, no promise beyond the next evening or the next practical excuse. Only a path likely to be walked again, a chair kept by treaty, maps on a table, mackerel as a future intention. And the knowledge, new and somehow already familiar, that the kitchen at the edge of the world had made room for a second cup without losing any of itself. The days that followed arranged themselves with outward simplicity. Elias did return. Not every evening. That would have been too eager for both of them and for the lighthouse, which respected proportion. But often enough. Once with smoked mackerel wrapped in newspaper. Once with a packet of clippings about shipwrecks no one in town could decipher except the two of them and perhaps the undertaker, who was rumoured to read 17th century handwriting for pleasure. Once with oranges from the weekly delivery boat. Once with nothing but a question about fog signals that somehow led to chowder and then to an hour spent on the stairs because the lantern mechanism had acquired a personality Mara refused to indulge alone. The kitchen learned him. His mug came to rest on the second shelf without being put away elsewhere by mistake. The bench beneath the window held the slight remembered wear of his seated weight. The linen towel sometimes ended up in his hands at the sink. His maps began to occupy one corner of the dresser. His hat, one evening, remained on the peg after he had gone because he had left in rain and only discovered it halfway down the path. Mara kept it overnight and found herself smiling at the sight of it in the morning in a way too foolish to confess aloud to anyone. He learned the kitchen, too, where the bread knife lived, which drawer stuck only in wet weather, how much salt Mara preferred in fish soup, that the second shelf in the pantry should never be trusted with onions after October, that the chair by the hearth belonged to Mara absolutely, and that the bench beneath the window was not a lesser prize but its own distinct jurisdiction, that when the wind swung northeast, the lantern room would likely need checking by midnight, that certain silences in this room meant thinking, others meant listening, and others, the best kind, meant simply being in the same place without explanation. Winter leaned in gradually. The sea grew iron-coloured more often. The harbour emptied earlier. The path held frost in the mornings and moonlight in sharper strips at night. The Lighthouse Kitchen responded as it always did. Thicker soup, more bread, dried herbs from the summer hooks, oranges studded with cloves near the stove, gloves on the peg, additional blankets over chairs, the whole room drawing its warmth closer and deeper. One evening, weeks later, while rain travelled in silver sheets across the glass and the beam moved through it like a long, patient blade, Elias sat at the table reading aloud from a shipmaster's letter dated 1872. "Sir," he read, "I must object in the strongest possible terms to the impractical temper of the western current, which appears to have taken against us personally." Mara, peeling potatoes at the counter, laughed. "That is an argument I understand." He continues in this vein for 3 pages. Then he may stay. Rain tapped the window harder. The soup tonight was fish and fennel. Linen dried near the stove. The sea outside was invisible beyond the glass, except when the light turned and made it briefly appear. All heave and brightness and black intervals. Elias lowered the page and looked at her. "I should tell you something." The tone altered the room instantly, not into danger, but into attentiveness. Mara set down the knife. "The Inland Post wrote again," he said. "The university." She waited. I declined. The rain went on. The lighthouse turned. Somewhere deep in the tower, the west gear gave its familiar hum. Mara crossed slowly back to the table. "Because of the archives?" she asked. "Partly. They are not finished. And otherwise." He looked at her directly. There was no performance in his face, which made what came next more difficult and more trustworthy at once. And otherwise because leaving began to feel less like movement and more like refusal. Mara felt the truth of it before she had decided what to do with the feeling. "Elias, I am not asking anything tonight beyond honesty." His hand rested beside the old letter, still open. "I only thought you should know that the path has ceased to be accidental for me." The room held the sentence carefully. Mara sat down. Outside, the rain softened a little, becoming finer and more slanting. She looked at the towel folded over the chair, at the steam from the pot, at the map corners under the butter dish, then at him. "It has ceased to be accidental for me too," she said. There it was. No grand language, no hurry, no future arranged in a paragraph. Just the truth, the sea, the kitchen, and the late evening holding them both. Elias let out a breath that might almost have been laughter had it not carried so much relief. "Good," he said quietly. "Good," Mara answered. Then, because the fish soup needed finishing, and because rooms like this are preserved by ordinary acts as much as by revelation, she stood and returned to the stove. Elias folded the shipmaster's complaint and set it aside. When they ate that night, nothing and everything had changed. The bowls were the same. The rain remained. The beam turned. The linen warmed by the chair. The sea went on breathing under the cliff. Yet the room had acquired a new kind of stillness. Not uncertainty, not tension. Rather the profound calm that follows when something true has finally been named in proportion to itself. Later, when the rain had eased and the kitchen had been set right again, Elias rose to leave. Mara walked him to the door as always. At the threshold, with the lantern between them and the sea dark below, he touched her hand once, briefly, as if asking a question so small it might have been mistaken for gratitude. She answered by not moving hers away. That was enough for that evening, and perhaps that was what made it so durable. Not the rush towards certainty, not the performance of romance in weather made for novels. Only one kitchen, one path, one rotating light above black water, one man who brought maps and fish and careful honesty, one woman who had learned from the sea not to trust declarations before their season, and yet also not to refuse warmth when it entered her own house plainly. Winter passed, as winters do, in storms, in soup, in maintenance logs, in the deepening familiarity of hands, finding cups and shelves and one another. Elias became part of the kitchen's weather without diminishing its solitude. Mara remained fully herself, which is to say, practical, sea-minded, dry in humour, tender in use, and increasingly unable to imagine late evening without the possibility of his step on the stone outside. By spring, the harbour would begun to notice, though the harbour noticed everything and rarely with malice. The grocer sent up lemons by accident on days Elias was known to be working late. The librarian returned charts more promptly than before and asked no questions, which in a small town is a form of blessing. The harbour master pretended not to see Elias climbing the path with books under one arm and a basket under the other, but his knee pain mysteriously improved whenever errands to the lighthouse required a messenger. And still, the kitchen remained itself. That mattered most. It did not become a symbol. It did not surrender to prettiness. It stayed what it had always been: a working room, a warm room, a room of soup and linen and steam and practical shelves, a room where weather could be heard and set against fire, a room where late truth, when it arrived, had somewhere honourable to sit down. Years later, on nights when the sea breathed low beneath the cliff and the beacon turned its pale, patient arc over black water, Mara would sometimes think back to that first late evening again. The knock, the damp shoulders of his coat, the satchel of charts, the marker lamp gone dark, the second bowl taken down, the line of light crossing the table, the sentence about being less adjacent to one's own life, the maps, the morning coffee, mackerel as future intention. And she would understand with even greater clarity what she had only half known then. That certain lives do not change by upheaval, they change by fit, by return, by the repeating courage of one path climbed again and again, by soup shared after the proper hour, by a towel passed at the sink, by weather delivered honestly to a kitchen door, by the slow recognition that companionship might, when rightly matched, does not crowd the room, it clarifies it. So if you imagine the lighthouse now, imagine the kitchen late. Let the sea be dark and breathing below. Let the wind move at the edges of the tower. Let the lamp above turn slowly, its beam crossing the water in patient silver intervals. Let there be hot soup on the stove, and linen warming on a chair, and bread on the board, and a map spread flat under a butter dish because paper has decided to curl. Let there be one mug already used, and another rinsed beside the sink, and perhaps a third because guests and weather are both poor at respecting quantity. Let the room smell of tea, fish, herbs, salt, and wood smoke. Let there be a bench by the window where someone sits listening to the tide. Let there be an armchair that belongs by treaty to the keeper of the light. Let there be no need for grandeur, only warmth, only maintenance, only a room outside nothing, but inside itself. Only the sea doing what it has always done. Only the lighthouse keeping watch. Only the kitchen at the edge of the world, making the late hour kind enough to enter. And if the knock comes at the door, let it come gently. Let it be someone carrying weather. Let it be someone who remembers where the bowls are. Let it be someone whose presence does not alter the room by taking it over, but by fitting into it so naturally that the room seems, at last, more fully seen. Then let the door open. Let the cold come in for a moment. Let the warmth answer. Let the soup be ladled. Let the towels remain warm. Let the sea and the light continue their patient old work outside. And let the night, having found a kitchen strong enough to hold both solitude and company without confusion, settle quietly over the cliff and water and tower and table. Because some evenings are not meant to astonish. Some evenings are meant only to be inhabited completely, late, warm, salt-scented, slowly lit, with linen by the chair, with soup in the bowls, with the sea at the window, and with the light turning and turning and turning over the dark.